My name is Deanna Pulliam. I'm 29 years old, and I was sitting in a lawyer's office in Clarksburg, West Virginia, watching my aunt tell a room full of people that I wasn't mentally stable, that my grief had made me paranoid, that I was seeing things that weren't there, that she was worried about me. When Gerald Fitch, the estate attorney, quietly turned his laptop around so everyone at the table could see the screen, and my grandmother's face appeared. She was sitting in her blue wingback chair, the one that's been in that living room since before I was born. She was wearing her coral cardigan and her gold stud earrings, the same earrings I was wearing at that exact moment, the ones I took from her jewelry box the morning of her funeral and never put back. And she looked directly into the camera with the calm, unhurried eyes of a woman who had already decided what she was going to say and wasn't afraid to say it. I'm going to tell you everything that happened in that room, but I need to take you back first, because none of it makes sense without the beginning. Before I do that, if you found this video, if something in those first few sentences made you sit up a little straighter, I want you to stay with me for this whole story. Hit the like button right now, subscribe so you don't miss the rest of it. And if you know someone who has ever been told they were overreacting when they were actually just right, share this with them. They need to hear it. And drop a comment before you keep watching. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it there? I'm always genuinely curious. Okay, let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia, in a house that was small and clean and never quite warm enough. Not because of the heat, but because of what was missing from it. My dad left when I was 6. Not in a dramatic way. He just got quieter and then less present. And then one day his truck wasn't in the driveway anymore. And my mom, Sandra, didn't cry in front of us. She just made dinner and helped me with my spelling words and kept going. That was her whole life, really. She just kept going. My mom was the younger of 2 daughters. The other one was Rhonda. Rhonda was 11 years older than my mom, and she had always occupied a different space in the family. More central, louder, more certain that she was the one people should be listening to. She married a man named Dale when she was 23, moved 40 minutes away to Bridgeport, and built what she always called her life, with a particular emphasis on the word that suggested my mother's version didn't quite count. She said things at family dinners that I didn't have words for when I was young, but that I understand now. Things like, Sandra has always needed more patience than the rest of us, said in front of Sandra, said like a compliment. My mother absorbed it the way she absorbed everything. Quietly, without argument, like she had decided a long time ago that the energy required to fight wasn't worth what she'd get back. The person who filled what my mother couldn't, not because my mother failed, but because she was carrying too much to also carry me, was my grandmother, Laurel. Laurel Pulliam was 4'11" in her good shoes, and she had opinions about everything from the correct way to fold a fitted sheet to what it meant to be an honest person. And she delivered all of them with the same gentle certainty, like she had thought it through carefully and arrived at the truth, and there was no reason to be dramatic about it. She came to every school play. She pressed $20 bills into my hand when my mom wasn't looking. She sat with me on her porch and told me the truth about things. Not sanitized truths, real ones. She told me that some people in families are scared that other people's happiness costs them something. She said it the way you say something you've known for a long time and have finally decided the other person is old enough to hear. I was 11 when I understood what she meant. Thanksgiving. Rhonda had driven over from Bridgeport, and she was on her second glass of wine before the food was even on the table. And she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, casual enough that nobody could quite call it an attack, that my mom had always been the difficult one, the one Laurel had to worry about, the one who made things harder than they needed to be. And she said it the way someone says a thing they've been wanting to say for years and have finally found an audience large enough to justify saying it. My mother went silent. I watched her face go completely still, and I watched her pick up her fork, and I watched her decide in real time to stay in her chair and say nothing. My grandmother looked at Rhonda, and then she looked at my mother, and then she looked at me. And she didn't say anything either. And I remember thinking, someone has to, eventually. Someone has to be the one who doesn't stay quiet. I filed that away. I didn't know yet that I was going to be the one. I want to tell you something about the kind of person I had to become in order to survive what came later, because I think it matters. I put myself through West Virginia University on a partial scholarship and a bookstore job that paid $11.40 an hour. I studied communications and legal studies, not because I had a 5-year plan, but because I was interested in how language gets used to move power around, which, looking back, makes complete sense. I graduated with a 3.6 GPA and $18,000 in loans and a 2014 Honda Civic that I bought myself with money I had saved over 2 years of not buying things I wanted. My mother came to graduation. She sat in the bleachers in the sun for 3 hours in the dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion. And when I found her afterward, she hugged me for a long time without saying anything. And then she pulled back and looked at my face like she was memorizing it. She said, I want you to know that everything you did yourself. And I know that sounds simple, but it wasn't. It was the most specific thing she ever said to me, and I have thought about it almost every day since she died. Rhonda did not come to my graduation. She sent a card with a $25 gift card to Applebee's inside it. I moved to Pittsburgh 6 weeks after graduation and started working at a housing nonprofit for $41,000 a year. My grandmother called me every Sunday at 7 p.m. without exception. She asked about my work and my apartment and whether I was eating real food and whether I had found anyone worth spending time with. She never made me feel like Pittsburgh was a betrayal. She never made me feel like leaving was the same thing as not loving her. That was the difference between her and Rhonda. Rhonda experienced other people's movement as abandonment. My grandmother experienced it as proof that she had done her job. If you have ever loved someone the way Laurel loved me, quietly, consistently, without keeping score, and if you have ever watched someone try to use that kind of love against you, then I think you already understand what I was walking into when I drove back to Clarksburg 14 days after her funeral. And if this is hitting close to home right now, if you are thinking about someone in your own life who gave you that kind of love, or someone who tried to take it from you, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, so you don't miss what happens next. And share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because what comes next is the part I have never said out loud to anyone except Corey. And Corey is my brother, and he was there. And even he didn't know all of it until the video played. My brother Corey is 24, and he is a foot taller than me, and he has the same dark hair, and he feels everything about 4 seconds after he feels it, which means you can always see it on his face before he knows it's there. He drove up from Charleston the morning of the reading because I texted him the night before and said, I need you to be in that room. No explanation, just that. He texted back, I'll be there. That is the thing about Corey. He doesn't ask why. He decides first and understands later, which is maybe not always the right order, but in this case, it was exactly right. He knocked on the door of my motel room at 7:45 the morning of the reading in his badly ironed gray button-down and his dark jeans, and he looked at me for a second and said, "You sleep at all?" I said, "Some." He said, "You want breakfast?" I said, "No." He said, "Okay." And he sat down on the edge of the bed, and we just sat there for a few minutes in the quiet. And that was enough. That was everything, actually. What I didn't tell him that morning, what I had not told anyone, was that I had a folder in my bag. A manila folder with printed copies of 3 emails my grandmother had sent me in the last year of her life. Emails I had never responded to in a way that showed I understood what she was actually telling me. Emails I had read and reread in the weeks since her death and finally understood. The way you understand something only after the person who wrote it is gone. I didn't know yet that my grandmother had her own folder. I didn't know yet that she had been preparing for this day far longer than I had. I just picked up my bag, touched the left earring, hers, gold, small, warm from my skin, and said, "Okay, let's go." Gerald Fitch's office smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. And the carpet was the kind of beige that had probably been there since 1994, and nobody had ever thought to change it because it wasn't offensive enough to replace. There was a round conference table with 4 chairs, a window that looked out onto Pike Street, a credenza with a small framed photo of a little girl in a soccer uniform that I assumed was his granddaughter. Rhonda was already there. Of course she was. She was sitting with her back straight and her blazer buttoned and her copper hair blown perfectly smooth, and her black leather handbag was sitting on the table beside her like it was also attending the meeting. She looked at me when I walked in the way she has looked at me for most of my life, not with hostility exactly, but with a kind of careful neutrality that was its own form of dismissal. Like she had already accounted for me and moved on. She said, "Deanna, just my name. The way you say a word you've decided is smaller than it thinks it is." I said, "Rhonda." Same tone. I had practiced that on the drive over. Corey came in behind me and his chair scraped the floor when he pulled it out. And I saw Rhonda's jaw tighten, just slightly, just enough. Gerald came in 2 minutes later with his legal portfolio and his silver wire-rimmed glasses and shook both my hands with both of his in the way that made me feel like he genuinely meant it. He said, "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," and I believed him. He sat down, opened his portfolio, adjusted his glasses, and began. He explained the estate in the organized, unhurried way of someone who has done this hundreds of times and understands that the slower you go, the less room there is for chaos. The house on Birch Street assessed at $214,000, a savings account holding approximately $38,000. And then he paused, just slightly, before he said, "An investment account that Laurel had maintained for 4 decades, which had grown to $91,000. He paused again. Rhonda set her hands flat on the table. He said, "There have been some changes to the account balances since the most recent estate appraisal." And that was when I understood why she had been so calm when I walked in. She had already decided how this was going to go. She had already written the script. I was just a prop in it. She said it smoothly, without hesitation, the way someone says a thing they have rehearsed until it sounds unrehearsed. That she had been managing the accounts, that Laurel had asked her to, that for the last 2 years, she had been the one handling everything. The finances, the appointments, the medications, the paperwork, while Laurel's health declined. She said all of this with a particular quality in her voice that I recognized. It was the voice she used when she wanted to sound burdened by her own competence, put upon by her own devotion. Gerald said, and the current balance of the investment account is $11,400. Corey said out loud, I'm sorry, what? I didn't say anything. I looked at the table. Gerald said it again, calmly. The account had held $91,000 at the time the will was executed. There had been a series of withdrawals over approximately 22 months, totaling just over $79,000. The room was very quiet. Rhonda filled it immediately because that is what Rhonda does. She fills silence before anyone else can put something true into it. She said the withdrawals were for Laurel's care, home modifications, medical equipment, in-home aids that insurance didn't cover. She said she had managed it all herself without asking for help, without being thanked, without anyone from the other side of the family showing up to assist. And then she looked at me, and her voice shifted, softened almost, and she said, I know this is hard to hear. I know she expected something, but Deanna wasn't here. She visited 4 times last year. 4 times. She let that number sit there. Then she said, and I think we all need to understand that what's happening right now, this reaction, is something I've been worried about for a while, since Sandra died. Deanna hasn't been well. I said it at the funeral, and I'll say it here. I'm worried about her. We all are. I want you to understand what that sentence does to a room. It doesn't attack you directly. It doesn't give you anything to argue against. It wraps itself around you like something caring, and it tells everyone present that whatever you say next should be viewed through the lens of your instability. It is the most efficient weapon I have ever seen used in a quiet room, and Rhonda had been sharpening it for years. She used it on my mother. She used it on anyone who got close enough to see what she was actually doing. Have you ever been in a room like that, where someone uses the language of concern to perform your erasure, where they say, I'm worried about you, and what they actually mean is, don't listen to her, where they know exactly which door to knock on because they know you'll answer, and then they use that door against you? I want to know if you've been there. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that. Because what I felt in that moment is something I don't think I've ever fully described to anyone, and I want to know if you recognize it. What I felt was a very old, familiar cold. Not panic, not rage, just cold. The specific cold of being 11 years old and watching your mother decide not to fight back, and understanding for the first time that silence is sometimes the only thing standing between you and something worse. Corey said, that's not true. His voice was steady, but his face wasn't. Rhonda didn't look at him. I opened my folder. I had printed 3 emails. I had the hospice care ledger. I had the contractor invoice for the grab bars and the ramp 8 months before the first large withdrawal, paid from the savings account, total cost $2,800. I laid them on the table, one by one, slowly, the way you put things down when you want every person in the room to watch you doing it. I said, do you have receipts for the modifications, the medical equipment, the in-home care? Rhonda said, excuse me? I said, the Medicare supplement plan covered 80% of the in-home aid. The hospital bed was a rental covered in full. The contractor Grandma hired herself 8 months before the withdrawals started. I have the invoice. Total cost $2,800. So I'm asking about the other $79,000. The room got very still. Rhonda's expression didn't collapse. That's the thing about people like Rhonda. They don't collapse immediately. They recalibrate. She straightened slightly. She said that I had no idea what it actually cost to care for someone through a decline like that there were expenses I wasn't accounting for, that this was exactly the kind of thing she meant when she said she was worried about me. This inability to see the full picture, this tendency to fixate. And I sat with that for a moment because here's the thing. She wasn't entirely wrong about what she was describing. I did fixate. I do have trouble letting things go when I know something isn't right. Sandra was the same way. Laurel used to say we both had a particular stubbornness about the truth, that we couldn't make ourselves pretend we didn't see what we saw, even when pretending would have been easier. Rhonda always called that a flaw. Laurel called it the thing that would eventually save us. I looked at Gerald Fitch. I said, can we continue? He said yes. He reached for his laptop, and he said there was one additional element to the estate documents that Mrs. Pulliam had asked him to present at the reading. Rhonda said, she didn't mention. Gerald said, she asked specifically that it not be mentioned beforehand. He turned the laptop so everyone at the table could see the screen. He said, your grandmother recorded a video statement 14 months ago on the same day she updated her will. She asked that it be played at the reading. He had not shared it with any party prior to today. And then he pressed play. The woman on the screen was smaller than I remembered her being, even though the recording was only 14 months old. She was in the blue wingback chair, the coral cardigan, her hands folded in her lap, perfectly still, the way she held them when she had decided something and there was nothing left to decide. She looked directly at the camera. She said, if you are watching this, then I am gone, and I am sorry for the trouble that has probably already started. I want to say a few things while I still can. She said, Rhonda, I know you have been in that account. I have always known. I did not say anything because I did not want the last months of my life spent at war with my daughter. But I kept records. I gave those records to Gerald. They are part of this estate file. Rhonda made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was the sound of something running out of road. Laurel kept talking. She said, I want to say something about Deanna. And here her voice changed. The careful, formal quality left it, and something else came through. Something that had no performance in it at all. She said, Deanna has her mother's eyes, and her mother's stubbornness, and her mother's way of going very quiet when she is the most hurt, so that you think she is fine, and she is not fine at all. I pressed my hands flat on the table. She said, I have watched that child hold herself together since she was 11 years old. I have watched her take care of herself when nobody else did. I have watched her love people who did not love her back correctly, and I have watched her survive that without becoming hard. Corey made a sound beside me. I heard him press his fingers against his eyes. I did not look at him because if I looked at him, I was going to come apart, and I was not going to come apart in this room, not in front of Rhonda. Laurel said, I am leaving her what I always meant to leave her, and I am leaving her this. She paused. Just one breath. I saw you, Deanna. I always saw you. You were never invisible to me, not for one single day. The video ended. The room was completely silent. Not the silence of people being polite, the silence of people who have just watched something real happen and don't yet know what to do with their bodies. Corey had both hands pressed over his eyes and his shoulders were moving and he wasn't trying to stop it. He was 24 years old and he had lost his mother 3 years ago and his grandmother 14 days ago, and he had driven 4 hours in a badly ironed shirt because his sister asked him to. And now he was sitting in a beige carpeted office on Pike Street while their dead grandmother told them she had seen everything and planned for everything and loved them on purpose and specifically, not just in the general way people say they love family, but in the precise, deliberate way of someone who had thought it through and meant every word. I understood it. I just couldn't do anything with it yet. I had to stay in my body for a few more minutes. Rhonda was sitting perfectly still. The performance of composure had finally cost more than she could pay. I watched it happen in real time. The way her face held its shape for about 4 seconds after the video ended, maintained by sheer muscle memory. And then something underneath it gave out. Not dramatically, just the effort stopped showing. The blazer and the pearl necklace and the structured handbag were all still exactly where she had placed them, but the person wearing them had gone somewhere else entirely. Gerald let the silence stay for a moment. Then he set his glasses on his legal pad and folded his hands and said, in his precise, unhurried way, that Laurel had flagged the account withdrawals with him directly approximately 16 months ago, that she had provided documentation of each transaction, that this documentation had been cross-referenced with actual receipts and invoices for verified care expenses, and that the discrepancy, the amount that could not be accounted for by any documented care cost, was $71,240. That this figure, along with the full paper trail, had already been submitted to the county probate court, that the estate had a legal mechanism in place to restore the investment account to its intended value through a structured agreement he had prepared in advance. He said, Mrs. Pulliam anticipated that this would be necessary. He said it without emphasis, like a fact, like weather. Rhonda said very quietly, she knew. Gerald said, yes, she knew. And then Rhonda picked up her handbag. She stood. She did not look at me. She did not look at Corey. She looked at a point somewhere above Gerald Fitch's head, and she walked out of the room, and the door didn't slam. It just clicked shut, which was somehow worse. I sat in Gerald's office for another hour after that. There were documents to sign. There were processes to understand. Gerald walked me through the probate timeline and the structured agreement and what it meant practically for the estate. And he did it in the same careful, thorough way he did everything. And I was grateful for it because having something concrete to focus on kept me from going somewhere I wasn't ready to go yet. Corey stayed beside me the entire time. At one point, he put his hand over mine on the table. I let him. I didn't say anything and he didn't say anything, and that was exactly right. When we finally walked out of the building and onto Pike Street, the March air was pale and cold and smelled like rain that hadn't started yet. I stopped on the sidewalk. I tilted my face up, not toward anything specific, just away from the ground. And I stood there for a moment and breathed. Corey stood beside me. He said, "You okay?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "That's fair." We stood there for another few seconds. Then he said, "She knew the whole time. Grandma knew the whole time, and she handled it." I said, "Yeah." He said, "She handled it without making the last months of her life a war." I said, "Yeah." He looked at me. "That's the most grandma thing she ever did." And that was the moment I almost lost it. Standing on a sidewalk in Clarksburg in my mother's watch and my grandmother's earrings, with Corey beside me in his badly ironed shirt, the smell of coming rain in the air. I reached up and touched the left earring, just the tip of my finger against the small gold stud. And I took a breath and I kept it together. Because I had a 4-hour drive ahead of me and I was going to need to be in my body for it. If that moment hit you the way it hit me when I finally let myself feel it, when I understood that my grandmother had spent the last year of her life quietly, methodically protecting me, without telling me, without asking for anything in return, without making it about herself at all, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. It's a small thing, I know, but it means more than you know, and I mean that genuinely. I drove back to my motel. I sat on the edge of the bed in my navy dress with my coat still on for probably 10 minutes before I moved. I didn't cry. I wasn't ready yet. I just sat there and let the quiet be quiet. Then I took out my phone and I called the one person I always called when something happened that was too big to carry alone. My friend Nora, who I'd known since the first week of college, who lived in Columbus now and had a 2-year-old and a job she mostly liked and a husband who made her laugh, answered on the second ring and said, "How bad was it?" I said, "She had a video." Nora said, "What?" I said, "Grandma made a video 14 months ago. Gerald played it at the reading." There was a pause. Then Nora said, very quietly, "Oh, Dee." And that was enough. That was all she needed to say. I told her everything. I told her about Rhonda and the investment account and the documentation and the video. I told her about Corey's face when Laurel started talking about my mother's eyes. I told her about the pearl necklace, Laurel's pearl necklace, the one Rhonda had been wearing, and about the way the door just clicked shut when Rhonda left. Nora listened the way she always listened, which was completely. No interruptions, no rushing toward the part where everything was okay. When I finished, she said, "What are you feeling right now?" I thought about it. I said, "Tired." And I don't know, like something settled. Like a thing that's been slightly wrong for a long time just went back into its right place. She said, "That's grief and relief at the same time. They feel similar." I said, "Yeah." She said, "She loved you so specifically, Dee. That's the thing. It wasn't general. It was specific." I want to sit with that for a second because I think it's the thing that made Rhonda's version of events so dangerous and Laurel's version so devastating in comparison. Rhonda loved my grandmother the way some people love, contingently, transactionally, with a running ledger of what had been given and what was owed. She had been present. She had managed the appointments and the paperwork and the medications, and those things were real. She did do them. But underneath them was an accounting, an expectation of return, a sense that proximity to a dying person entitles you to what they leave behind. And Laurel saw that. She had probably seen it for years. And she didn't rage about it, didn't cut Rhonda off, didn't spend her last months in confrontation. She just documented everything, planned carefully, made sure that what she intended to give got to the person she intended to give it to. That is not the behavior of someone who was confused or manipulated or declining. That is the behavior of someone who understood exactly what was happening around her and made a choice about how to respond to it. She chose protection over confrontation. She chose precision over drama. She chose me and Corey and the memory of my mother over peace with someone who had mistaken her patience for permission. I stayed in Clarksburg one more night. I didn't go to Laurel's house. I wasn't ready for that yet, for the blue wingback chair and the coral cardigan smell and the kitchen where she made coffee every morning for 40 years. That was going to require a different kind of preparation. Instead, I drove to the cemetery just before dusk. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like something from a movie, but I want to be honest with you about what I actually did. And what I actually did was drive to the cemetery and park the car and walk to where they'd buried her 12 days earlier and stand there in the pale March cold with my coat pulled tight and talk to her. Not out loud. I'm not sure I could have managed out loud, but in the way you talk to someone when they're gone and you have things left to say, in the quiet interior way that is half memory and half conversation. I told her I got it. I told her I understood what she had done and why she had done it, and that I wasn't going to waste it. I told her about Corey's face in that office. I told her that her earrings were warm from my skin and that I was probably never giving them back. I told her I saw her too, that I had always seen her, that she was not invisible to me either, not for one single day. The rain started while I was standing there, just light, the kind that's more mist than rain. I stayed for another few minutes anyway. Then I walked back to my car and sat in the driver's seat and finally let myself cry. Not 4 minutes this time, longer than that. The ugly kind, with my forehead against the steering wheel. The kind you can only do alone in a car, in a cemetery, in the rain, when there's nobody watching and you've been holding it together for 2 weeks straight. When it was done, I sat up. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my coat. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror for a moment. My grandmother's earrings, my mother's watch, my own face. I drove back to the motel. I ordered soup from a diner 2 blocks away. I ate it sitting cross-legged on the bed with the TV on for company, and I slept for 9 hours, which was the most I had slept in 2 weeks. In the morning, I drove home to Pittsburgh. I want to tell you what happened after because I think people assume that once the truth comes out, everything gets clean and simple and resolved, like a knot that finally loosens and falls open and you can just move forward. That's not how it works. The truth coming out is not the end of anything. It's just the beginning of a different kind of work. The first thing that happened was silence. Not peaceful silence, the full kind. The kind that means phones aren't ringing that used to ring, that group texts have gone quiet, that people who had opinions about everything suddenly have nothing to say. I had 3 cousins on Rhonda's side who had spent the 6 months after my mother's death sending me occasional check-in texts. The kind that are warm enough to feel like connection, but vague enough to cost nothing. After the reading, those texts stopped. No explanation, no confrontation, just nothing. I noticed it the way you notice a sound that's been in the background of your life for so long, you stopped hearing it. And then one day it's gone, and the quiet is louder than the noise ever was. Nora called me 2 weeks after I got back to Pittsburgh and said she'd heard through someone, a mutual connection from college who still had family in Clarksburg, that Rhonda had told people her own version of what happened at the reading. In Rhonda's version, Gerald Fitch had made procedural errors. The documents were being contested. Deanna had manipulated Laurel in her final months, had been calling more frequently toward the end, had influenced the will update. I sat with that for a moment when Nora told me. Then I said, she's telling people I manipulated a 79-year-old woman with dementia. Nora said, Laurel didn't have dementia. I said, I know that. Nora said, everyone who knew Laurel knows that. I said, I know that too. And I did know it. But knowing something is true and being immune to the pain of having it said about you are completely different things. I sat at my kitchen table in Pittsburgh with my phone in my hand, and I felt the particular cold of it. The specific cold I had felt in Gerald Fitch's office. The one I had felt at 11 years old, watching my mother absorb a dinner table insult without flinching. And I made a decision. I was not going to spend my energy fighting a story that had no evidence behind it in a town I didn't live in, to an audience that had already decided what they wanted to believe. I was going to let Laurel's documentation do what Laurel had built it to do. The probate process took 4 months. I'm not going to walk you through all of it because most of it was paperwork and waiting and emails from Gerald that I read carefully and filed carefully and responded to carefully, which is exactly what Laurel would have expected me to do. What I will tell you is that the structured agreement held. The estate was restored. What Laurel had intended for me was protected by what Laurel had documented, which is the most precise possible example of her character. She didn't leave justice to chance or to the goodwill of people who had already demonstrated they didn't have any. She built a mechanism. Gerald called me when it was finalized. He said, everything has been processed. Your grandmother was very thorough. I said, yes, she was. He said, I've been doing this for 31 years, and I don't often see that level of forethought from someone in her situation. She came in here 16 months before she died. She told me exactly what she believed was happening. She gave me every piece of documentation she had. And she said, and I'm quoting her because I wrote it down, she said, Gerald, I need this to work even if I'm not here to explain it. Can you make it work? I said, what did you tell her? He said, I told her yes, and I meant it. I held the phone for a moment after he said that. I said, thank you for meaning it. The news traveled the way news travels in a small city, slowly at first and then everywhere at once. I heard about it through Nora's connection, the same channel Rhonda's version had come through. Except this time the story was different because Gerald's filing with the probate court was a matter of public record, which meant anyone who was curious enough to look could find it. And in a city like Clarksburg, enough people were curious enough to look. I don't know exactly when the shift happened. I just know that one day Nora called and said, "People know." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "I mean, everyone knows, Dee." And I said, "Okay." I didn't celebrate. I want to be clear about that. There was nothing to celebrate. Laurel was still gone. My mother was still gone. $79,000 and 4 months of legal process could not fix either of those things. And the aunt I had grown up watching at holiday dinners was now someone I would probably never speak to again, which was not a victory so much as a specific kind of loss on top of all the other losses. What I felt was not triumph. What I felt was tired, in a way that went all the way down. And underneath the tiredness, something beginning to settle, like ground that has been disturbed finally going still. 3 weeks after the probate finalized, my phone rang, and it was a number I recognized but hadn't seen in almost a year. My cousin Janelle, Rhonda's youngest, who was 33 and had always been the one in that family who seemed slightly uncomfortable with how things were done, who had always laughed a little too quickly at things that weren't quite jokes. The way people laugh when they're trying to signal that they know something's wrong but can't figure out how to say it yet. I almost didn't answer. I answered. She said, "I don't know if you want to hear from me." I said, "I'm listening." She said, "I want you to know that I didn't know about the account, about what my mom, I didn't know the extent of it. I knew she was managing things, but I didn't ask questions I should have asked." I said, "Okay." She said, "I'm not asking you to forgive her. I'm not even asking you to forgive me. I needed you to know that I'm sorry, specifically, for not asking questions." I sat with that for a moment, because here's the thing about an apology that names the specific thing. It's so much rarer than a general sorry, and so much harder to dismiss. Janelle didn't call me to feel better. She called me to be accurate. And accuracy in my family had always been in short supply. I said, "I appreciate that, Janelle. I mean it." She said, "Grandma loved you so much. I hope you know that." I said, "I know. She made sure I would." We talked for another 20 minutes, carefully, like people testing ice, but honestly. She told me that Rhonda had not contested the probate findings, that she had agreed to the structured repayment, that she had stopped talking about it, which Janelle said was its own kind of answer. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. When I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about Rhonda for a long time. Not with anger, with something more complicated than anger. The specific, complicated feeling of understanding someone clearly and still wishing things had been different. Because here's the thing I keep coming back to. Rhonda was not wrong that she had been present. She had driven Laurel to appointments. She had sat with her. She had managed things that were genuinely hard to manage. That was real. The problem was that she had turned it into a transaction without telling anyone, including maybe herself. She had loved her mother the way she knew how to love, which was with a ledger. And then she had decided that the ledger entitled her to something that wasn't hers to take. I don't know what it costs to be that person. I don't know what it costs to spend 2 years caring for someone and simultaneously stealing from them and convincing yourself that those two things are compatible. I think it costs a great deal. I think Rhonda has been paying that cost in ways I'll never fully see. That doesn't excuse anything, but it makes her human. And I needed her to be human because the alternative, making her into something purely calculated and cold, would have made it easier to hate her. And I didn't want to spend my life carrying that. I wrote her a letter. Not to send, or I didn't decide ahead of time whether to send it. I just wrote it because I had things I needed to say somewhere outside my own head. I wrote, I know you believe you earned what you took. I know that in your version of this story, you are the one who was there and I am the one who wasn't. And that entitlement is not the same as theft when you've given enough. I know that story makes sense to you. But what you took wasn't money, or it wasn't only money. What you took was a choice my grandmother made with her own hands about her own life, about who she wanted to leave something to. And that choice was hers. Not yours. It was always hers. I wrote, I watched you do to me what you did to my mother for 30 years. I watched you use the language of concern to make people doubt what they saw. I watched you do it so smoothly that I think you've stopped knowing you're doing it. That is the saddest thing I can say about you. And I mean it as a sad thing, not a cruel one. I wrote, I am not going to chase you. I'm not going to keep being angry. I have too many things to build. I sat back and looked at it for a long time. Then I folded it and put it in the drawer of my bedside table. Not because I was afraid to send it, because I realized that sending it would be for me, and I had already given Rhonda enough of my energy. What I needed now was to keep it, to know I had said it somewhere, even if only to myself. I texted Corey a photo of the first paragraph. Just that. No explanation. He texted back 4 minutes later. That's exactly right. You should keep it. I wrote back, I am. He wrote, good. Also, I ironed a shirt correctly for the first time yesterday. I wrote, send proof. He sent a photo. It was actually pretty good. My name is Deanna Pulliam. I'm 29 years old, and I am sitting at my kitchen table in Pittsburgh on a Tuesday morning in April with a cup of coffee that's slightly too hot to drink yet, and the window cracked because the air finally smells like something other than cold. And I am thinking about my grandmother in the way I think about her most mornings now. Not with the sharp, specific grief of the first weeks, but with something quieter, something that feels less like loss and more like company. I think about her in her blue wingback chair, looking at a camera, saying what she needed to say. I think about the 14 months she spent knowing what she knew and choosing not to spend her last good time on earth in conflict. I think about the way she folded her hands in her lap when she had made a decision and there was nothing left to decide. I think about her saying, I saw you. You were never invisible to me. I touched the left earring, small, gold, warm. I don't know if she can hear any of this. I don't know what I believe about that. But I know that she left me something more than money. She left me a record of what it looks like to love someone precisely and on purpose, without keeping score, without asking for anything back. She left me proof that you can see what's happening around you clearly enough to document it, clearly enough to plan for it, and still choose to spend your remaining time in something other than war. That is the thing I am trying to carry forward. Not the inheritance, not the vindication, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't need it. The way she loved, the precision of it, the refusal to make her love into a transaction. I am 29 years old and I have $18,000 in student loans and a Civic with 114,000 miles on it and a one-bedroom apartment in Pittsburgh and a promotion that finally actually came through last month. I have a brother who irons his shirts now and calls me on Sundays. I have Nora in Columbus and Gerald Fitch's card in my wallet and a folder of documents I hope I never need again. And I have my grandmother's earrings, which I am keeping. I told you at the beginning that I was sitting in a lawyer's office watching my aunt tell a room that I wasn't stable, and that Gerald Fitch turned his laptop around and my grandmother's face appeared. I told you I was going to tell you everything that happened in that room. I hope now you understand what was really happening in that room. It wasn't a legal dispute. It wasn't a family falling apart. It was a woman who had spent 79 years watching the people she loved be made smaller, and who decided, quietly, precisely, without drama, that she was not going to let that happen one more time. She saw it coming. She planned for it. She loved us loudly enough to matter even after she was gone. That's the whole story. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. Has someone ever quietly protected you in a way you only fully understood after it was too late to thank them? A parent, a grandparent, a teacher, a friend? Someone who saw what was coming and did something about it without ever making it about themselves. I want to know. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that more than I know how to say. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt familiar or true, or like something you needed to hear today, like this video, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being seen clearly by even one person is enough, that it counts, that it lasts. My name is Deanna Pulliam. Thank you for listening.